1. What are the different kinds of evaluation criteria's events? 1. Created. 2. Created and every time edited to meet the criteria. 3. Created and edited to subsequently meet the criteria. 2. What is the difference between created and every time edited to meet the criteria and created and edited to subsequently meet the criteria? If we select created and every time edited to meet the criteria. Whenever we create a record or edit a record, if the criteria of the workflow rule meets, then it will trigger every time. If we select created and edited to subsequently meet the criteria. While creating the record, criteria meets, so that workflow will fire. And while editing the record again, criteria meets, workflow won't fire. Which is meeting the criteria to meeting the criteria. While creating the record, criteria doesn't meet, so workflow won't fire, and while editing the record, workflow criteria meets, then workflow will fire, which means not meeting the criteria to meeting the criteria. Conclusion. Previous state of record should be not meeting criteria and current state of record should be meeting the criteria. Then only in current state workflow will fire. 3. What are the types of rule criterias? Criteria meet. Field operator value. If there are multiple criterias, then in filter criteria we can give conditions like 1 or 2 and 3. Field-to-field comparison is not possible. We can't fetch the previous state information of the field. Formula evaluated. We can write formulas. With this we can do field-to-field comparison and we can fetch previous state value of the record. 4. What is immediate workflow action? The action which will be performed immediately after the record criteria meets. For example, if a workflow rule is set to trigger an email alert. When a new lead is created with a certain lead source, the email alert action would be considered an immediate workflow action. Similarly, if a workflow rule is configured to update a record status when specific conditions are met, the update action would be immediate. Immediate workflow actions provide real-time responses to changes in data. 5. What is time-dependent workflow action? The action which will be performed in future, based on the any of the date field. To create time-dependent workflow action, we should create one time trigger. In time trigger we can give either days or hours with the maximum of 999 value, and we can select either before or after. 6. For which event we can't create time-dependent workflow action? Answer: created and every time edited to meet the criteria. Time-dependent workflow actions cannot be created for the created and every time edited to meet the criteria events. When a workflow rule is triggered by the created event, Salesforce executes the associated immediate actions immediately after the record is created. Since there is no waiting period involved, time-dependent actions are not applicable in this scenario. Similarly, when a workflow rule is triggered by the every time edited to meet the criteria event, Salesforce reevaluates the rule criteria each time the record is edited and saved to determine if the criteria are met. Since this event does not have a specific time frame, it is not possible to define time-dependent actions that should occur after a certain duration from the event. Therefore, time-dependent workflow actions are only applicable for events such as a created, and any time it's edited to subsequently meet criteria or created, and any time it's edited to subsequently meet criteria and every time it's edited. These events involve a waiting period after the trigger event, allowing for time-dependent actions to be scheduled and executed accordingly. 7. What are the different kinds of workflow actions? 1. New field update. We can update a field of the same object or the fields of the parent objects which are at master side in master detail relationship. Only for master detail parent objects we can update the field, and for lookup we can't update. 2. New email alert. We can send emails if the criteria meets. 3. New task. We can create new task. 4. New outbound message. We can make a call out. 8. What are the types of email templates? 1. Text. These templates are suitable for sending basic emails without any formatting or styling. 2. HTML with letterhead. HTML email templates that allow you to include formatted text, images, links, and other HTML elements. These templates can also include a predefined letterhead, which is a header and footer design used for branding purposes. 3. Custom HTML without letterhead, HTML email templates that provide full customization options without a predefined letterhead. You can design these templates using custom HTML and CSS to create personalized email layouts. For Visualforce, email templates that are created using Visualforce markup language. These templates offer advanced customization capabilities and allow you to integrate dynamic content and logic using Visualforce components and controllers. 9. There is a time-based workflow which will update one of the fields if the criteria meet. User submits the record with valid criteria, workflow triggered so that the field update is queued in the time-based flow queue which will fire after 1 day. If the user modifies the record which is submitted before the scheduled date, after modification, a record criterion is not meeting. Whether the field will be updated or not in scheduled date? Answer: it won't trigger in the scheduled date because if we modify the record to not meeting criteria, that queued field update will be removed from the time-based flow queue. 10. For the same scenario explained in the previous question, what happens when we deactivate or modify the criteria of the workflow to different criteria? Whether the field will be updated or not in scheduled date? Answer: yes, it will trigger in scheduled date. 11. There are two workflow rules on the same object, say namely workflow 1 and workflow 2. If workflow 1 fires, then a field will be updated on the same object. If the field is updated and due to this workflow 2 criteria meets, then what will happen? Workflow 2 will fire or not? Answer: it won't fire. To fire workflow 2, we should enable Reevaluate Workflow Rules checkbox of the field update which is there in workflow 1. 12. What is recursive workflow rule? How to avoid recursive workflow rules? Whenever we enable Reevaluate Workflow Rules after field change checkbox in the field update of a workflow rule, due to this field update, other workflow rules on the same object will be fired if the entry criteria of those workflow rules satisfied. In other workflow rules also, if we enable Reevaluate Workflow Rules after field change checkbox in the field update, recursive workflow rules will come in some scenarios. We can take 2 steps to avoid recursive workflow rules. For the workflow evaluation criteria, if you choose Created, and any time it's edited to subsequently meet criteria option, we can avoid recursive workflow rules. If you don't enable Reevaluate Workflow Rules after field change checkbox in the field update of a workflow rule, we can avoid. 13. What is approval process? An approval process is a mechanism in Salesforce that allows users to submit records for approval if they meet certain criteria. By clicking the Submit for Approval button, users can initiate the approval process for a record. Additionally, the approval history related list should be displayed on the record detail page to track the progress and history of approvals for the record. 14. How to configure approval process. Before creating the approval process, we should select the object. After that, we should follow below steps. 1. Give the approval process name. 2. Give the criteria of the approval process. Select the email template. If we don't select any email template, Salesforce by default will send an email notification to the target approver, else with our selected email template target approver will be notified. Select the users who can submit for the approval. If we do not select any user, by default all the users who can access to that record can submit. Select the user to whom record should be submitted. Initial submission actions. After submitting the record for approval, immediately whatever the actions included in the initial submission actions section will be triggered. Approval steps. We can add multiple steps. For each and every step we can see approval actions and rejection actions sections, where we can add actions to be performed. If the approver approves the record, then actions which are under Approval Actions section will be triggered. Final Approval Actions section. If all the steps approved, then actions which are under Final Approval Actions section will be triggered. Final Rejection Actions section. If any one of the step rejected, then actions which are under Final Rejection Actions section will be triggered. Recall Approval Actions. After submitting record for approval, if you want to revoke, we click on Recall Approval Action on the detail page. After clicking on that button, actions which are under Recall Approval Actions section will be triggered. 15. After activating the approval process, I want to add one more step. Is it possible? Once an approval process is activated in Salesforce, you cannot directly add additional steps to it. However, you have an alternative approach. Deactivate the existing approval process. Clone the deactivated approval process. Add the new steps or modifications to the cloned approval process. Activate the modified approval process.